GM everyone, and welcome to Smart Contact, an interview series with the world's most influential and impactful Web3 leaders. This podcast is produced by Web3 Harbour and is supported by Circle, our 2024 lead sponsor, and by Invest Hong Kong, co-sponsor of the Smart Contact series at Blocktober. Like and subscribe for more Smart Contacts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joey, co-founder of Terminal 3, and today's Smart Contact guest is the one and only Clara Tsao. We just went through an incredible background for Clara. You, in my definition, are the embodiment of civic tech. Those accolades that Jeff just mentioned are pretty incredible. So just very quickly, let's talk through a little bit about your background and how you ended up being a founding officer at Filecoin.
Yeah, I think my background is pretty simple. I think since I was very, very young, I've always known I wanted to help solve inequality in this world. I wasn't quite sure exactly how, but I had a really strong moral compass by values that my grandmother had taught me growing up to really think about solving hard problems in this world. And so for me, going through a number of different places throughout my career, I've always thought about what is the best way for me personally to do this. And I grew up in Silicon Valley in the backyard of a lot of technology innovation. And I thought to myself, access to information is really the key for upward mobility for every corner of the world. As we see more and more people around the world be able to access the internet, being able for them to learn how to navigate careers, how to get open information, that was key. And that's actually what we're doing at the Filecoin Foundation today. More and more people realize the importance of data as an asset that they have to keep like a utility. And sometimes accessing and being able to upkeep data can be unaffordable. The other thing that tends to happen is there might be data silos or even censorship data in countries where governments might end up removing the democratic access to particular types of information. And so for us, we really believe that knowledge is probably the most important thing that can really uplift society as a whole. And building the world's largest decentralized storage network is the most efficient way to do that. I've also seen today's version of the web be weaponized by very bad actors. We can imagine terrorist organizations using the current structure of the web, which is built off of an advertising model, to really recruit people to join terrorist organizations or to plot attacks that blow up crowds. And when you see the worst of the worst of the web, really what you come to is the incentive structure of the web is broken. Today, there is not a single company that is built off of a model that doesn't monetize off of user data. And this is why when you can actually think about changing how data is stored on the web, you can also change the additional incentive structure that companies can be built off of. And I think we can have a much better and more open version of the web when we can achieve that.
Okay, we're gonna dive into so many of those different components, centralized storage, Filecoin specifically, its use cases. But let's start with DePin. Of course, Filecoin is probably the most notable project protocol within DePin. And DePin was the buzzword of 2024. And you guys were in the space years ago, before it was cool, before it was coined. How would you explain DePin? And then we can talk Filecoin.
Yeah, DePin stands for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. And the best way to think about DePin is, in my version, it changes the way that you can think about incentive structures for physical infrastructure. So a lot of times when you think about centralized companies, for example, the cloud in our case, AWS, if it got hit by a bomb, all the servers and businesses would go down. But when you have a decentralized network of storage providers building data centers all around the world, even if there's a single point of failure, there's always versions that can help upkeep that data. And we believe that information can not only be more resilient, but even more secure, and also be able to be offered to more people when we have a distributed network like that. You can also think about DePin in other ways. We have a great company that's building on top of Filecoin called WeatherXM that is actually crowdfunding weather stations. So today you can actually buy their weather stations online and have a little weather station in your home. If you live in a rural area where you constantly get inaccurate weather data, it's because most weather companies these days, they're incentivized to only put weather stations in areas where they can make money. And that actually leaves a lot of data untapped around the world that nobody can access as information. And so when you can actually create an incentive structure where entrepreneurs that want to be their own weather expert, they can not only have their local station, but also make it even better and get compensated for that. You create a network of even more accurate data all around the world. And there's tons of other DePin projects that have emerged the last year or more, thinking about distributed compute, distributed GPUs. The list goes on, and we're so excited for everyone else that's building on top of it, because you see a lot of real world use cases that wouldn't be able to exist as business models if it wasn't for decentralized infrastructure.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about distributed compute, decentralized AI. Later on, we're going to dig into a lot of that. But like you mentioned, DePin, there's so many different applications of it. Decentralized storage is Filecoin is one of the many. You mentioned decentralized, weather forecasting and monitoring. There's also examples of, wireless networks where, in today's traditional world, we're, very used to AT&T and T-Mobile and, traditional cellular networks and towers. But now with companies like Helium Network, we're taking, mini hotspots, globally and taking all of that, distributed network. There are examples of, mapping. We're very familiar with Google Maps. And now there's an example of Hive Mapper where everyone can have a custom dash cam on their vehicle and then help essentially monitor and map out the global routes of the world. But let's talk about decentralized storage and Filecoin specifically. How would you explain the mechanics of decentralized storage and specifically Filecoin?
Yeah, Filecoin is pretty simple to explain, in my opinion. Think about hubs all around the world where there's entrepreneurs building their own data center. Some of them are storing enterprise-grade data. Some of them are more mom and pop shops. But it allows for a whole network to customize how data can be stored. They use Filecoin as an open source technology to be able to actually allow for storage of data that they might be unused in their local data centers. And so when you think about conversations, even in recent news, around the race for AI and the lack of compute and lack of GPUs, the lack of data centers, we think that the most efficient use of data centers is to be able to maximize each data center, to be able to store as much as possible. And I think this is an even more important narrative as we think about the types of AI data that need to be stored. The network operates where we have proof of space-time, which validates when data is stored on our network, but there are multiple copies in all of different spots across the network. And so there's, like I said earlier, not a single point of failure. If one data center goes down, other people can serve it up. And the data can't be seen by those that are storing it because we're using blockchain technology to really make sure that data is secure. Beyond that, I think there's also new kinds of technology that we are able to leverage in our network that really allows for people to see at the point of upload how data's change over time. So in an age where people might be concerned about generative AI or where exactly AI training models are pulled from, we can actually track and trace that. And that comes from the storage layer. Today, in a centralized model, if something is stored and some monopoly just decides to take it down, it's really hard to prove how that data was changed over time. There's also been governments around the world that a lot of citizens have been concerned about whether data has been altered. And I think a lot of, you mentioned civic tech earlier, which I'm a huge proponent of. If data is going to be open, you want to be able to make sure that the public has accountability to changes. And a lot of times, governments can just take down data at their own whim if they don't like data that's shared in a previous administration, or maybe it's an issue that they don't care as much about.
Yeah.
And we think that public accountability is so important. And so we do a lot of work actually in the public sphere of backing up data sets that we believe every single person in the world needs to access.
Yeah.
And these include, for example, the Flickr Commons, which is all the Flickr photos from back in the day that people uploaded, and making sure that there's a repository of those kinds of photos. We also work with journalists all around the world to make sure that we can verify that their photos are taken at the point of upload. In the case of Ukraine, we work with a number of human rights groups all around Ukraine to make sure photographic evidence from the war can be one day admissible in international criminal court, because sometimes those photos, people might argue, might be altered, or journalists might accidentally take photos from other wars, right? So we've all seen those scenarios before.
So I'm hearing, transparency, accountability. These are some of the, key value propositions and, strengths that decentralized storage and Filecoin can essentially provide. Most of the institutions today, companies, universities, these entities are, of course, very accustomed to centralized, data storage. They're familiar with your Google Clouds and your AWSs and, maybe even Oracles. How would you communicate the, key value propositions of a system like Filecoin, decentralized storage? Why is decentralized storage a better alternative? You mentioned, accountability, transparency. What are the other things that we can essentially communicate to convince these institutions to adopt decentralized storage?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So everyone in this room probably touches storage at more of a consumer level, but imagine if you're a large research institution like CERN, who we're working with petabytes of data, and you have to move it at some point. Unfortunately, today in a more centralized web, most people that have huge amounts of data to store, they're locked in. There's high egress fees, and it's impossible to migrate. At some point, when AI and other data is built off of an existing data set, it becomes even harder to even have the choice to think about moving it anywhere else. And for us, we want to make sure that, especially when it comes to large archival data sets, we not only can offer that at a fraction of the costs from AWS or other kinds of options, but we also want to make sure that it can be accessible by researchers all around the world. And this is especially important when you think about scientific data that maybe multiple researchers around the world are all building off of. If they are uploading different data sets that may not be able to be verified is the exact right copy, that might lead to science experiments gone wrong and a lot of millions of dollars of research funding going to waste. And so there's so many examples of this where when you think about huge amounts of data, it's critically important. When you think about the rise of self-driving cars, if you go to San Francisco these days, you'll see self-driving cars everywhere. Each one of those cars can produce up to 1 terabyte of data per hour. There's an accident that happens and companies end up throwing away data or not being able to prove what went wrong. It becomes challenging for public safety as well. And so for us, we think about the entire supply chain of how data is used and what data is created. We want to make sure that it's not only able to be migrated, but also accessible in terms of a price point. And also resilient, like I said before, where it just doesn't go down because a data center suddenly goes down.
Yeah. To build on that, I completely agree with all these points. And Terminal 3, our company, also leverages decentralized storage. When we talk about cost and pricing as a perspective, Filecoin decentralized storage is magnitudes cheaper than a centralized solution like AWS and Oracle. From a security perspective, decentralized storage is also just much more foolproof. There's no single source of failure. There's no issues around trust and accessibility. Even for privacy, when you leverage decentralized storage and Filecoin and IPFS, all of that data is encrypted and then atomized and then distributed across hundreds, if not thousands of networks and nodes. Whereas from a centralized perspective, it's just all in a single server or data center. You brought up the point about petabytes and exabytes. We're talking about vast volumes of data. So I'm actually gonna read off a couple of metrics that I found from Filecoin. This is from December of 2024, so fairly recently. When we talk about Filecoin's raw byte capacity, we're looking at 4.4 exabytes. Also, I'm just gonna make a quick non sequitur because this is a fun fact. Maybe everyone here knows, but this is certainly something new I learned. We're all familiar with the term a kilobyte. So a kilobyte is 1,000 bytes. It's 10 to the third power. But there is a very closely connected metric called a kibibyte, K-I-B-I. So instead of 1,000 bytes, it's 1,024 bytes. So that's 2 to the 10th power. And that's because from a computing perspective, for computing and storage, computers operate off of a binary system. So it's off of base 2. So when we're talking about exabytes or exabytes, I think this is like 10 to the 16th power of bytes or 2 to the 60th power of bytes. These are massive volumes. So if we talk about storage first, how has Filecoin been able to build this vast network of storage capacity? Who are these storage providers?
Yeah, so you can imagine Filecoin's network similar to Airbnb. Today, Airbnb has tons of hosts that have available space, and they can make money if people want to live in those extra spaces. And I tend to think about another technology from the Filecoin ecosystem called IPFS, Interplanetary File System. This is an open source technology anyone can use where it does similar features like Filecoin, except it's free to use. And that's very similar to another company back in the day called Couchsurfing, where if people wanted a free place to stay, they could sleep on someone's couch. But if you're going somewhere on a business trip and you're messaging someone to say, hey, can I use your couch? And that person tends to be, busy or something comes up, they're not necessarily incentivized to open that door and let you crash there. And so when Airbnb came in, it was interesting because now people are getting paid to actually host people. And that's the same way for us, where initially we had introduced as a network the interplanetary file system, which you can store files on, but you also might get less guarantees for retrieval because you're dependent on all these hosts to serve back the data. So when you want to actually be able to compete against AWS and traditional storage providers, you want that guarantee that the hosts are going to be paid. And that's where Filecoin comes in. It's that incentive model that allows, similar to how Airbnb hosts get paid in US dollars, it's that incentive model to make sure that we can get those guarantees that the data will be served. And it also creates a creative ecosystem of people building all kinds of data centers. We have data centers, for example, in Amsterdam, where there's an entrepreneur there that decided he wanted to build one that was completely off of solar panels and super environmental. He actually got a government grant to be able to do that. And his design of the data centers, we've been able to share with other storage providers around the world if they wanted to go in a more environmental route. I think the other benefit of decentralized storage is really the user choice to be able to customize what they want. Today, if you store your data in a centralized provider, you have no idea where your data is going, right? And some people might be sensitive to regions. They may not want their data stored in Russia or elsewhere. And so we really give users also the choice of, do they want something cheaper? Do they want something that is more enterprise grade? Do they want it in a specific location? So having a network of choice, similar to how you can choose on Airbnb a more luxe experience or something that feels more homey, that gives a lot of options out there beyond just the properties of decentralized network.
So these these storage providers aren't necessarily like a random Joey Liu with a laptop and a hard drive that has excess capacity of like 100 gigabytes, but these are primarily like you said, entrepreneurs who are starting these data center companies or organizations who have the proper network and security and storage capabilities, and these are individuals or companies based globally all around the world, right?
Yeah, and it actually could be a Joey. I mean, we've had, for example, gaming companies that built their own data centers and they had extra storage space. And they were like, I want to make money in the extra capacity. It does take work, it's not like, hey, I'm just, certain Airbnb rooms might have little work involved, but it does take a little bit of work. But we've had mom and pop shops type of data centers, and we've also had really sophisticated ones that have 100 people running it. So we have all kinds of options for different kinds of storage. And I think that's what's beautiful about it is our goal at the foundation is really to enable an open marketplace of people to build on-ramps to all kinds of storage solutions. Today, when you think about storage, there's really 4 categories we think about. There's one, large-scale archival storage, which most people don't touch as consumers, but it might be libraries, or if you're in film, a lot of film archives, things that just take up a lot of data. It might be AI companies or self-driving cars having a lot of archival data they just want to index somewhere, but they don't want to access at a frequent basis. Then you have hot storage, which we're all pretty familiar with. When you have Google Drive photos or documents you want to quickly access, we have a ton of companies building on-ramps to make it super easy to access that. And then we also store all kinds of data in the Web3 world. If you own an NFT today, you're already using Filecoin IPFS. If you've paid $5 million for a monkey picture, maybe you don't want that to go down, just in case there's a 404 error. And a lot of Web3 companies these days, while they might say they're decentralized, actually are still storing in a centralized means. And so we give them an option to say, hey, if you want to be fully decentralized and have all your gaming files on a decentralized network, we do that. And then we also do chain archival backups. So we've worked with Solana and also the Cardano ecosystem to back up all of their chain data. So there's so many kinds of storage. It's a huge space. And our goal is really to enable as many startups in our ecosystem to go after markets where this kind of technology has a lot of good product market fit. And so over the last year, we've had over 200 startups really build all kinds of on-ramps and solutions. And it's been really exciting to see. And there's also, like you've mentioned, a lot of DePin companies as well. I think about Huddle01, which is this company that came out of hackathons that we hosted over the years. And they're building a version of Zoom where it's fully decentralized. And you can really control how your video conference data is hosted and stored. So
very, very cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned 4 general categories of data that could be, stored, distributed via Filecoin.
Sorry to interrupt the video, but I want to tell you about our smart contract lead sponsor, Circle.
What is Circle?
At Circle, we're building a digital dollar that brings the power of the internet to money.
Circle's the place where crypto meets stability,
where local businesses meet global customers,
and the US dollar meets USDC.
Meet Circle.
Thank you to all of our sponsors and community partners. Now back to the conversation.
And then going back to some of the metrics I found, we talked about 4.4 exabytes of raw data capacity in terms of the actual data storage currently being leveraged by storage clients. I think I saw it was around 2.4 exabytes, so already greater than 50% utilization. Would you know roughly between those 4 categories, like which category is taking up the most of Filecoin's network of storage?
Yeah, right now we have tons of data that's archival storage. If you've ever used the Wayback Machine or an organization called Internet Archive, we work with them to make sure that they have a very efficient means of backing up all their data. They're creating archives of the web every single day. So that's really important. They also do what's called the end of term crawl. Every presidential election, you'll imagine all the websites change over. And we have so much data from that. One thing that's really exciting for me in the age of AI, because it has been a huge theme this week at Consensus Hong Kong, is also a lot of people don't realize that today's version of the web is actually not a version of the web that would be the same if you walked into a physical library where you wanted a book about gardening and you get all the results out there. It's a web where you have to actually filter and know that the business model is off of advertising. So if you know SEO, if you pay a lot of money, you might get featured first. And I think that's the danger of a lot of AI data today where it's being trained on, is the sources of data is coming from particular segments. And there's a lot of data out there that are really critical to the knowledge of the world that we want to make sure also AI and AI agents can actually also unpack. So we have an organization in the US called Muckrock that we support. They offer access to freedom of information requests, which are requests when people ask the US government, I would like to see this email correspondence that the public should be able to access. But often that data is often hard to unpack and find. And so we've worked with decentralized AI companies like Theoric to really build an agent to be able to unpack lots of interesting data that the public has never been seen before. And so I did want to add to that because a lot of people, when they use the internet today, they take a lot of it for granted without questioning where that source of data might be coming from. Or if you have ever used Wikipedia, people forget that Wikipedia contributions, most of it is coming from white Caucasian men in the Western world, right? And a lot of the history that a lot of people pull that data from may or may not be fact checked or representative of all views. And so those are the things that we also like to think about, because access to information at the end of the day is so critical. And we don't want data monopolies to continue to snowball.
Yeah, I know Filecoin has also been doing incredible work with, let's say, Starling Lab. I know recently there was maybe a little bit unrelated, but there was like a headline about Filecoin with Lockheed Martin, something in space.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to briefly touch on those two really cool case examples.
Yeah, so Starling Lab is an amazing organization run out of Stanford University, and they do a lot of work around content authenticity. So in previous years, we've helped store a ton of videos from Holocaust survivors because we believe that data should be accessible to everyone. Starling has also worked with a lot of media outlets in the US to really document and verify that journalist photos were coming from their source. And so Starling is an amazing partner, and they continue to do a lot of work in the human rights and journalism world. Lockheed Martin is a really interesting one because I spoke earlier about IPFS, Interplanetary File System. And we actually worked with Lockheed Martin around 2 years ago to say, what if we could deploy our technology to space? Because a decentralized storage network is actually not just replacing AWS. There's a lot of properties that make it even more unique. And one of these examples are today, if you were to send a file between two satellites in space, the file in a centralized model would have to go back to a data center in the US and then go back up to the other satellite. And we were able to work with Lockheed Martin to use IPFS to send files from one satellite directly to another, and really deploy a decentralized network in space to really show the possibility, because that was where the name came from. So I think analogies like that really help people understand we are so different from traditional storage. There's unique properties, and it is like asking somebody before Airbnb existed, how would you feel to stay in a stranger's home that you don't know and pay for it, right? Like, and there's a lot of unique properties Airbnbs provide today for families with kids, and features that are a lot more different than staying at a hotel. And sometimes it's better, sometimes it's less optimal, but we, at the end of the day, want to give users as much choice when it comes to where they want to store their data. And there's going to be people who prefer more centralized models. There's going to be people who want to go fully decentralized. And there's also people that might want a hybrid approach. So over the last 2 years, we've actually gotten a lot of interest from traditional enterprises that wanted to look into decentralized storage, because they recognize that their systems have a single point of failure. They're vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks. They have a lot of other optimization features that might lead to high costs. And so we started an organization called the Decentralized Storage Alliance that brings together a ton of traditional enterprises like Ernst & Young, AMD, Intel, where they get to be part of the discussion on the roadmap of learning about building a decentralized storage network, and also how they can get involved. So it's not just competing against each other, but also there's a really strong hybrid approach too for people that don't want just everything on one single network.
Yeah, so we're seeing the same thing with an increasing number of enterprises who are also looking for alternatives to traditional centralized solutions, and that's also one of the key premises that Terminal 3 is built on, where we serve as a user data oracle to help onboard user data through decentralized storage so that it is self-sovereign. User data remains secure and private, but still accessible and composable. And a lot of the drivers behind this are, one, just general consumer behavior and philosophy and expectation about data ownership, but also increasingly from a companies and corporate perspective, increased regulation. We'll get to that in a second. Tailwinds around data privacy, data security, scrutiny, increasing number of fines, and also just the amount of spend that these enterprises and their security and compliance teams are investing in just for general data compliance and security. So can definitely resonate with the thesis behind Filecoin and enterprise adoption. So we talked a lot about different use cases for Filecoin and different types of data that can be stored decentrally, and one key area that we mentioned and is now the topic of the discussion, especially here at Consensus, is around decentralized compute, decentralized AI. And Filecoin definitely has a very strong position and role to play here. So in my mind, when I think about decentralized AI, I think about it in three different layers. At the top, you have the application layer, and this is the layer that we're generally familiar with. This is where users are directly interfacing with the AI agents, the AI assistants. A layer below, then you have the data layer or the knowledge layer, and this is the data, whether it's text or audio or video or whatever it is, that is used to essentially train all these AI models that are then generating the applications. And then at the bottom, and arguably the most important layer, could be the DePin layer, the decentralized physical infrastructure network, where you are providing all the necessary computation and storage resources to enable the application as well as the data layer. So from Filecoin's perspective, as the leading decentralized storage provider, what is your role in decentralized AI, and where do you see Filecoin contributing over this next wave of growth?
Yeah, and that's a great way of putting it in those three layers. And I think the beautiful part about our technology, beyond it being open and available for anyone to build on, is that we have a very easy way to collaborate very quickly with all kinds of companies with storage needs. So when we talk about compute and extra GPUs, we've worked with companies like Aether to really allow for making sure that beyond GPUs, they're also storing on the decentralized network with us. We're working with companies like Bagel, which is a research AI company around decentralizing AI models. When it comes to AI agents and also particular challenges like generative AI, and also how, for example, artists can get compensated these days when a lot of their work is out in the open or in the public. We have companies like LilyPad that are making it possible where you can actually track and trace how artists, their content are used over time, and that they can get fairly compensated. So I think in the world where there are tons of creators and people who have built businesses off of the web and content being a key piece, we think that content integrity is going to be key for those businesses to continue to thrive and have the right business model for fair compensation. And I think AI is so wonderful, but we also want to make sure that AI stays in an open and accessible way. A lot of companies today claim that they have open models, but a lot of how they store and where they're pulling from remains not so transparent. And so we can actually do that in terms of proving where data sets are being stored, how it's coming from where they're stored, and offer a way for that transparency. I think what you're doing, especially in identity, is going to be really important as we think about more innovation to come in the blockchain space, like homomorphic encryption. Today in the US, one big challenge is healthcare data, where there's compliance measures like HIPAA. I remember many, many years ago, I used to run a medical clinic, volunteering my time in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And I remember dealing with a lot of patients that did not have a single medical history. They didn't have identity. A lot of them were on the streets, and the only time they can access healthcare was when they were so sick they could be admitted to an emergency room. And it was such a challenge because they had no sense of what drugs they took, what was in their system, or what was wrong with them. And when you think about decentralized storage, along with what you guys are doing at Terminal 3 with identity, you can actually allow for AI models to be able to offer insights to particular trend lines in health and also in scientific research that doesn't quite violate user privacy and can be in compliance with local laws. And I think innovations like that are going to be so important, that requires the entire stack of DePin companies to come together and allow for also regulators to really understand the opportunities that these technologies provide. I think in this day and age, we sometimes get too caught up in headlines of blockchain tech that is used more for fun, but doesn't actually solve real world problems. And I think it's really exciting to be able to highlight how world changing some of blockchain technology can be.
Absolutely. So this morning you were on a panel at Consensus Hong Kong talking about decentralized compute. And there were really good discussions around the opportunities around decentralized AI. But then there are also, questions about how does decentralized AI kind of stack up against, today's, leading AI systems. Of course, you have, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and probably, some other newer models that haven't been released yet. And then, like you said, these are arguably trained on, black boxes. We don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. There are open source models like Meta's Llama and, of course, DeepSeek that is now, the talk of the town. So I wanted to get your perspective on, decentralized AI and how it kind of, stacks up and how it's, going to be positioned going forward.
Yeah, I think today it's great that a lot of AI models are open. I remember years ago, I worked at this company called Microsoft between the Satya and Ballmer eras, where Microsoft for years was a very closed company. And suddenly, within a few years, they bought GitHub. They really embraced open source. And you saw the entire software industry flourish when you saw more open source models of what people could build off and how more quickly developers could ship code. And I think that's my excitement around open models today in the AI space. I think it's a challenge because a lot of the leading AI companies today are funded by big tech. When you look at the top AI companies that have tons of market share that are being used by many users, most of the checks are written by the major companies that own cloud data and storage today. And so that sense of trust, do we actually trust that these companies are being authentic in how they're protecting user data and what they can and can't share? Are there other incentive reasons that might be misaligned? I think those are the questions that a lot of people who are thinking about the decentralized AI movement really care about, is thinking how we can do better and how we can rebuild trust and how we can use an open system of people all around the world to be able to contribute and have that better. I think a lot of the questions these days also in the AI discussion, I was in Davos a few months ago in January, was really this question about AI and energy. There's a whole geopolitical race around who's going to be the country that wins in the AI game. And at the end of the day, also a lot of bottlenecks in innovation in AI and compute come from access to the supply chain of resources. And I think that's where a lot of existing DePin projects can play a role, is you can use excess compute or excess GPUs or excess storage that no one's used and be able to have a more optimal setting to be able to power innovation. And I'm really excited for not only those places to exist in places where it's already developed, but also in places in the world where people haven't had that opportunity to succeed. A lot of times we think in a very Western world perspective in the US or even here in Hong Kong, there's a lot of flourishment in finance and other sectors. But I think it gives everyone a chance to contribute as entrepreneurs to the AI race. So I think overall, I'm very excited about how open a lot of AI development is these days. I think it's great that DeepSeek kind of added a spark to being able to add lower costs. I think a lot of questions people have, at least from the West, is really around the privacy component of how much they can trust DeepSeek coming from China. But at the same time, I think it fosters a lot more access to information that can fuel even more innovation, even better ways of how to do things. And I think DeepSeek really did that in China, where everyone thought you needed a particular type of configuration in order to do AI training well. And they were able to push against that.
Yeah. So this brings a nice segue to, the final couple of questions on the topic, which will be around, let's call it, the policy and, regulatory implications for decentralization, whether it's decentralized storage or decentralized AI. Like we discussed earlier, there are these, shifting, you can call it, trends or tailwinds in the regulatory space. Specifically when it comes to, let's say, data regulations, privacy, intellectual property, and now with the advent of artificial intelligence, authorization, authentication, and all of that. Of course, no one can predict the future, but I wanted to get your perspective on where you see some of these shifts happening. How do you do you foresee, Filecoin positioning itself as the decentralized, storage player in this space? And what are some of the potential opportunities or challenges that you can see down the road?
Yeah, I think we are very excited about the regulatory environment and also the education from a lot of policymakers these days, and really taking an open look at blockchain, how it works, and different use cases of it. I think a lot of the meme coin discussions often catch the public attention and headlines these days, but we also really think it's important that a lot of policymakers understand how DePin technology is very different from stablecoins, which are different from Bitcoin and other currencies that people end up trading without necessarily a utility component to it. So those are really important to us. I think it's really exciting that a lot of governments are also thinking about AI safety and AI policy, but I think it's also challenging when some of them, out of a fear-based approach, tend to create regulation that doesn't quite make sense. When I first went to DC, actually in 2013, I actually was the director of the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee, and I hosted, I believe, one of the earliest discussions on Bitcoin on the Hill. And I remember talking to regulators in the US where they had no idea what digital currency or Bitcoin actually meant. And I think we've come a long way. I mean, it's interesting to look back in time and even remember when in 2015 or 2016, when Mark Zuckerberg first testified on the Hill, I was there in person, just how confused the world was in terms of how many members of Congress didn't even understand how social media works. And so for me, I think it's great that a lot of companies these days are working with governments, help them understand especially what an open, transparent technology system blockchain enables. I think a lot of regulators are probably unsure how to regulate because of it being an open market where they don't quite have that central point of control. But I think I'm very optimistic about the talent, especially. I think all around the world, we're seeing really, really talented people that also choose to roll up their sleeves and serve in government or try to be in the forefront of being in policymaker roles than what I saw around a decade ago. And I think that's really positive. I think here in Hong Kong, you see a lot of government officials really willing to learn and really willing to experiment, and also seeing the opportunity for local job economy and growth when it comes to entrepreneurs being able to build amazing companies here. And also the additional talent that comes from Hong Kong's history in the financial sector. I've talked to so many people that went from TradFi to DeFi or other angles here this week. So,
Clara, unfortunately, we are running short on time, and I wish to continue this conversation. We can talk a lot about Hong Kong that you just mentioned, but we will have to bring the Smart Contact to a close. So, Clara, thank you so much again for being our special guest, and to our listeners, hope you tune in next time.